Professor Kythara watched the human female walk through the Galactic Academy's entrance hall, her four eyes narrowing in what could only be described as barely contained amusement. The creature moved with such confidence. How quaint, how utterly, ridiculously misplaced. "Look at her," whispered Vorthak, his tentacles twitching with barely suppressed laughter. "Does she actually think those primitive appendages will help her navigate the quantum physics simulation?" The human, something called Maya Sinclair, according to the registration files, stood exactly 5 feet 6 inches tall, pathetically small by galactic standards. Her species had only recently figured out faster-than-light travel, and here she was, attempting to enroll in the most prestigious academy in 3-star systems. The sheer audacity was, well, it was almost admirable. Almost. 37 species have attempted the entrance examinations this cycle, Kythara noted to her colleague, her voice dripping with the kind of academic superiority that only came from centuries of watching lesser beings fail spectacularly. 36 passed the preliminary screening. "Let me guess," Vorthak's purple skin rippled with what passed for a smirk among his people. "The human didn't even make it past the basic cognitive assessment." "Oh, she did." Kythara paused for dramatic effect, savoring the moment. "She scored adequately." The word adequately hung in the air like a bad smell. In academic circles, adequate was practically an insult. It meant you'd survived, nothing more. Maya stood in the center of the crystalline examination chamber, completely unaware that half the faculty was placing bets on how quickly she'd wash out. The smart money was on 37 minutes, the optimistic money was on an hour. Professor Zelenth, who had a soft spot for underdog species, had boldly wagered she might last 2 hours. Nobody, absolutely nobody, bet on her actually passing. The first test was elegantly simple in its complexity. Candidates had to solve a 4-dimensional spatial reasoning puzzle while simultaneously calculating hyperspace navigation coordinates and composing a diplomatic treaty between 3 warring civilizations. Most species required their best mathematical minds, their most skilled negotiators, and their top engineers working together. The Academy expected individual candidates to handle it alone. In 43 minutes. "Beginning test sequence Alpha," announced the Academy's artificial intelligence, its voice carrying that special blend of politeness and condescension reserved for the soon-to-be eliminated. Maya cracked her knuckles. The sound echoed through the chamber like small explosions, causing several observers to flinch. What kind of biological mechanism made that noise? And why did it sound so ominous? The holographic display materialized around her, showing a complex maze of interconnected geometric shapes floating in space. Each shape pulsed with different colors, representing various physical laws and mathematical constants. The navigation coordinates scrolled past in 17 different alien languages, updating every 3.7 seconds, and somewhere in the middle of it all, 3 virtual ambassadors began screaming at each other about mining rights on a moon that may or may not have existed. "Fascinating," murmured Professor Kythara, leaning forward despite herself. "She's not even looking at the primary display matrix." Indeed, Maya seemed to be ignoring the most obvious elements of the test entirely. While other candidates typically started with the spatial reasoning component, it was, after all, the foundation for everything else. The human was humming. "Is that some kind of primitive calculation method?" Vorthak asked, genuinely curious now. "A mnemonic device, perhaps?" The humming continued. It was a simple melody, something that sounded vaguely mathematical in its repetition. And while she hummed, Maya's hands moved through the air, manipulating the holographic elements with casual precision. She grabbed a rotating hypercube, flipped it inside out in a way that made several physics professors wince, and somehow turned it into a navigation beacon. "That's not how 4-dimensional mathematics works," Zelenth said slowly, his compound eyes focusing and refocusing as he tried to track her movements. "No, it isn't," agreed Kythara. "But it's working." The navigation coordinates were falling into place with disturbing ease. Maya seemed to be treating the complex mathematical relationships like a 3-dimensional puzzle, rotating and connecting elements in ways that technically shouldn't have been possible. She grabbed a string of hyperspace calculations, twisted them into what looked like a pretzel, and somehow produced a stable wormhole trajectory that would have impressed a master navigator. Time elapsed. 14 minutes, 37 seconds. the AI announced helpfully. 14 minutes. She was solving the mathematical components in 14 minutes. The current record holder, a brilliant Xanthari physicist, had needed 28 minutes just for the navigation portion. But the real test was yet to come. The diplomatic simulation. The 3 virtual ambassadors were now threatening to declare war over the right to name a crater on an uninhabited asteroid. Ambassador Threx insisted it should be called the Glorious Crater of Eternal Victory. Ambassador Yilla preferred the aesthetically pleasing depression of harmonious understanding. Ambassador Gorth, demonstrating the legendary subtlety of his species, wanted to call it Big Hole. Previous candidates had spent hours trying to find compromises, crafting elaborate treaties with subclauses and appendices. The most successful had managed to prevent only 2 of the 3 wars. Maya listened to exactly 30 seconds of their argument, then did something unprecedented. She laughed. Not a polite, diplomatic chuckle. A genuine, from the belly laugh that echoed through the chamber and made the virtual ambassadors stop mid-threat to stare at her. "I'm sorry," she said, wiping tears from her eyes. "I'm sorry, but this is ridiculous. You're about to start 3 separate wars over what to call a hole in the ground on a rock that none of you actually want." Ambassador Threx drew himself up to his full holographic height. "The naming of celestial features is a matter of utmost cultural significance." "Sure it is," Maya nodded seriously. "That's why I'm going to solve this right now. The crater will be called the crater formerly known as Big Hole of Glorious Harmonious Victory." Silence. "It's got all your names in it," she explained patiently. "Threx gets his glory and victory, Yilla gets harmony, Gorth gets his big hole, and the formerly known as part makes it sound mysterious and important. Everyone wins, nobody dies, and we can all get on with our lives." The 3 ambassadors looked at each other, then back at Maya, then at each other again. "That actually works," admitted Ambassador Yilla. "I can live with mysterious and important," added Threx. "Big hole," declared Gorth, apparently satisfied. Test completed. Total time, 19 minutes, 43 seconds. The chamber fell silent, except for the faint hum of cooling holographic projectors. 19 minutes, 43 seconds. The previous record had been 2 hours and 16 minutes. "That's impossible," Vorthak whispered, his tentacles hanging limply at his sides. "The mathematical complexity alone should have taken at least an hour." "And the diplomatic portion," added Zelenth, his voice faint with shock. "She didn't even read the cultural background files. She didn't study the historical precedents. She just laughed at them." Professor Cathara found herself staring at the human with something approaching respect, which was disturbing on multiple levels, not least because she'd built her entire career on the assumption that humans were barely evolved primates with delusions of intelligence. "Perhaps," she said carefully, "we should look at the test sequence beta results before we draw any conclusions." Test sequence beta was where the real elimination happened. It was a comprehensive examination of advanced quantum mechanics, requiring candidates to demonstrate mastery of 17 different theoretical frameworks, while solving practical problems that had stumped some of the galaxy's brightest minds for decades. The test included things like calculating the probability matrices for spontaneous wormhole generation, designing functional faster-than-light communication systems, and explaining why the Heisenberg uncertainty principle didn't actually apply to beings with more than 4 spatial dimensions. It was the kind of examination that made grown Xanthari cry and caused normally peaceful Deltharian monks to contemplate violence. Maya stood in the center of the new test chamber, surrounded by floating equations that would have given a mathematician nightmares. Quantum probability clouds swirled around her like angry ghosts, and somewhere in the distance, a holographic representation of spacetime itself was having what could only be described as a nervous breakdown. "Beginning test sequence beta," the AI announced, and somehow it managed to sound sympathetic. This was where the human would break. Had to break. The sheer computational requirements were beyond what any single organic mind could handle. Even the most advanced AI systems needed several minutes just to process the initial parameters. Maya looked around at the swirling mathematical chaos, nodded once, and said, "Okay, this is actually pretty cool." Pretty cool. She was describing advanced quantum mechanics as pretty cool. "The first problem appears to be asking me to calculate the exact moment when a particle in quantum superposition will collapse into a definite state," she mused. reaching out to grab a handful of probability equations. But that's kind of missing the point, isn't it? Missing the point? Professor Cathara felt something that might have been the beginning of a migraine forming behind her secondary eyes. The thing is, Maya continued, apparently talking to herself as much as to the test system, quantum mechanics isn't really about prediction. It's about possibilities. So instead of trying to calculate when the particle will collapse, why don't I just give it some options? She waved her hand through the probability cloud, and somehow impossibly the equations began rearranging themselves into more stable configurations. Instead of fighting the uncertainty, she seemed to be embracing it, turning the quantum chaos into a kind of organized randomness. That's not how quantum mechanics works. Vorthak protested, but his voice lacked conviction. No, agreed Cathara, watching in fascination as Maya continued to manipulate concepts that should have been purely theoretical. But it's working. The next problem involved designing a faster-than-light communication system. Traditional approaches required massive energy expenditures to create quantum entanglement pairs, then careful management of the entangled particles across vast distances. The engineering challenges were staggering, the power requirements astronomical. Maya studied the problem for exactly 47 seconds, then grabbed what appeared to be empty space and twisted it into a knot. There, she said, dusting off her hands. Instant communication across any distance. That's not a communication system, Zelenth objected weakly. I don't know what that is. It's a spatial fold with a quantum entanglement matrix embedded in the dimensional substrate, Maya explained helpfully. You talk into one end, the words come out the other end. Distance is irrelevant because technically there is no distance. The 2 points exist in the same location, just accessed from different dimensional angles. The professors stared at her explanation, then at the impossible knot of twisted space she'd created, then back at her. That should work, Cathara admitted reluctantly. I have no idea why it should work, but the mathematics are sound. Sort of makes you wonder why nobody thought of it before, Maya said with a shrug that somehow managed to be both modest and infuriating. The final problem was the real killer. It was a paradox that had been unsolved for over 4 centuries. How to reconcile the Heisenberg uncertainty principle with the observed behavior of higher dimensional beings. The greatest minds in the galaxy had tried everything from complete reformulations of quantum theory to inventing entirely new branches of mathematics. Maya read the problem statement, blinked a few times, and then started laughing again. Oh, come on, she said between chuckles. This isn't a physics problem. This is a perspective problem. A perspective problem. 4 centuries of theoretical physics, reduced to a perspective problem. The uncertainty principle only seems like a limitation because we're looking at it from a 3-dimensional viewpoint, she explained, her hands sketching shapes in the air that hurt to look at directly. But if you're a higher dimensional being, you're not limited by 3-dimensional observation methods. You can see particles from angles that don't exist in our spatial framework. She paused, tilting her head like she was listening to something nobody else could hear. It's like, imagine you're trying to understand a coin flip by only looking at it edge on. From that perspective, you can never see both heads and tails at the same time. But if you can look at it from above, suddenly there's no uncertainty at all. You can see the whole thing. The holographic equations around her began shifting, rearranging themselves into patterns that actually made sense from a mathematical standpoint while simultaneously being completely impossible from a physical one. Test sequence beta completed. Total time, 23 minutes, 12 seconds. 23 minutes. The silence in the observation chamber was so complete that they could hear the ventilation systems humming in the walls. I think, said Professor Cathara very carefully, we may need to revise our initial assessment of human cognitive capabilities. Revise our assessment? Vorthak's tentacles were writhing in what his species called existential confusion. She just solved problems that have stumped our best minds for centuries, and she did it by laughing at them. Well, Zelenth pointed out with the kind of fairness that comes from having your entire worldview crumble in real time. Laughing at problems is a perfectly valid problem-solving technique. We just never tried it because it seemed undignified. Maya was now stretching, rolling her shoulders like she'd just finished a pleasant workout, instead of revolutionizing several branches of theoretical physics. She looked up at the observation windows and waved cheerfully. as if she could see the professors staring at her in slack-jawed amazement. "So," she called out, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber's speakers. "What's next? Please tell me there's more tests. This is actually fun." Fun. She was having fun. Professor Cathara realized that she was going to have to do something she'd never done before in her long and distinguished academic career. She was going to have to admit that a primitive, recently spacefaring, barely evolved human was smarter than she was. The thought was so disturbing that she almost missed the AI's next announcement. Candidate Maya Sinclair has completed the preliminary examination phase with the highest scores in Academy history, proceeding to final evaluation protocol. The highest scores in Academy history. The Academy had been operating for over 2,000 years. They had tested the finest minds from hundreds of different species, including races with brains the size of small buildings and collective intelligences spanning entire solar systems. And somehow, a human from a planet that had only recently figured out nuclear fusion had just broken every record they had. "I need a drink," muttered Vorthak. "I need several drinks," agreed Zelenth. Professor Cathara just stared at the human through the observation window and wondered if maybe, just maybe, the galaxy had been looking at things from the wrong perspective all along. The final evaluation protocol was something that had only been used 17 times in the Academy's entire history. It was reserved for candidates who had demonstrated such exceptional ability that the standard testing procedures were no longer adequate to measure their capabilities. It was also, according to the Academy Charter, supposed to be impossible to reach on the first attempt. Maya Sinclair, it seemed, had a talent for doing impossible things. The final evaluation protocol chamber was different from anything the Academy had ever constructed. It existed in 17 dimensions simultaneously, powered by the collective computational might of 3 artificial superintelligences, and maintained at a temperature just above absolute zero, to prevent the exotic matter from achieving sentience and filing complaints with the Galactic Ethics Committee. Dean Zareth materialized in the observation deck, his energy form crackling with what could politely be called concern and more accurately be described as barely controlled panic. As the Academy's highest authority, he had personally overseen the construction of tests that had humbled the greatest minds in galactic history. The final evaluation protocol was his masterpiece, an examination so comprehensive, so impossibly difficult, that completing it was considered more legend than possibility. "Status report," he demanded, his voice resonating across 17 different frequency ranges simultaneously. "Sir," Professor Cathara began, her 4 eyes refusing to meet his energy signature. "The human has exceeded expectations." Define exceeded. She broke the preliminary test records. All of them. By margins that our statistical analysis department is calling mathematically improbable to the point of suggesting reality malfunction. Dean Zareth's energy form flickered. In his 2,000 years of existence, reality had malfunctioned exactly once, and that incident had required evacuating 3 star systems and filing paperwork with entities that existed outside normal spacetime. He did not want to deal with that again. "How is this possible? We tested her species. Humans scored average on every metric we could measure." "That's just it, sir," Vorthak interjected, his tentacles forming complex knots that indicated deep philosophical confusion. "We measured them correctly, but we measured the wrong things." Down in the protocol chamber, Maya was examining her surroundings with the kind of casual interest most beings reserved for mildly entertaining television programs. The 17-dimensional space didn't seem to bother her. The exotic matter swirling around her feet might as well have been morning fog, and the 3 superintelligences monitoring her every thought, she'd already waved at them and asked if they needed anything. "Beginning final evaluation protocol," announced Arius 7, the most advanced artificial intelligence ever created. Candidate will face 3 ultimate challenges. First, the consciousness paradox. The chamber transformed, reality folding in on itself until Maya stood in a space that existed everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. Before her materialized the consciousness paradox, a problem so complex that it had driven artificial intelligences insane and caused organic minds to simply shut down rather than attempt comprehension. The challenge was simple in statement, impossible in execution: prove that consciousness exists without using consciousness to make the proof. Philosophers had spent millennia on this problem. Entire civilizations had built their belief systems around various attempted solutions. Wars had been fought over competing theories. Maya studied the paradox for approximately 15 seconds, then burst into delighted laughter. "Oh, this is brilliant," she exclaimed, clapping her hands. "It's like asking someone to prove they exist without being alive to make the argument." The observers in the control room exchanged glances that, in several cases, involved sense organs that didn't technically exist in normal space. "She understands the fundamental impossibility," Zalinth whispered. "Most candidates don't even grasp why it's paradoxical. But understanding it doesn't solve it," Dean Zareth pointed out. "The greatest minds in past." He was interrupted by Maya's voice, clear and confident, echoing through the interdimensional space. "The answer is that the paradox itself is the proof." Aria 7's processing cores actually stuttered for a nanosecond. "Please elaborate." "Consciousness can't be proven by consciousness, right? That's circular reasoning. But the very fact that we can conceive of this paradox, that we can recognize it as impossible, that we can feel frustrated by our inability to solve it, that's consciousness in action. The paradox exists because consciousness exists. If there was no consciousness, there would be no paradox to solve." She paused, tilting her head in that uniquely human gesture of consideration. "It's like asking, can an omnipotent being create a stone too heavy for them to lift? The question itself proves the concept it's questioning is flawed. You can't have consciousness questioning consciousness unless consciousness is real." The chamber fell silent. Even the exotic matter seemed to pause in its swirling. Challenge 1 completed. Solution: elegant, original, philosophically sound. Time elapsed: 4 minutes, 37 seconds. 4 minutes. The record holder, a collective intelligence spanning 14 worlds, had taken 6 months and achieved only a partial solution. Second challenge. Aria 7 continued, and there was something that might have been excitement in the AI's voice: the engineering impossibility. The space around Maya shifted again, becoming a vast workshop filled with materials that shouldn't exist, tools that operated on principles of physics that hadn't been invented yet, and a task that would have made the builders of megastructures weep. The challenge: build a machine that could create energy from nothing without violating the laws of thermodynamics. It was the ultimate engineering problem. Every civilization eventually faced the energy crisis that would determine their survival or extinction. The laws of physics were clear: energy could neither be created nor destroyed, only converted from one form to another. Creating energy from nothing was impossible. Maya walked around the workshop, picking up tools with the casual familiarity of someone examining kitchen utensils. She hefted something that looked like a crystalline hammer but probably manipulated fundamental forces, tested the edge of what appeared to be a saw designed to cut through space-time itself, and nodded approvingly at a device that had no visible function but hummed with barely contained power. "So the problem is that I need to create energy without violating thermodynamics," she mused, apparently talking to herself again. "But thermodynamics assumes a closed system." She started assembling components with the kind of confidence that comes from either deep expertise or complete ignorance. Given what they'd seen so far, the observers were no longer sure which was worse. "What if the system isn't closed?" Maya continued, connecting what appeared to be a probability engine to something that looked like it might be a dimension stabilizer. "What if I just borrow energy from somewhere else?" "Borrow energy?" Aria 7 asked, and the AI's voice carried notes of curiosity that probably violated several laws about artificial intelligence emotional development. "Sure. There's energy everywhere, right? Vacuum fluctuations, zero-point fields, quantum foam bubbling with virtual particles. I can't create energy from nothing, but I can sure as hell relocate it." The machine she was building defied description. It had components that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, pipes that carried force instead of fluid, and a control panel that somehow made perfect sense despite having buttons labeled with mathematical concepts that didn't have names. "The trick," Maya explained, making some final adjustments with a tool that appeared to be rewriting the laws of physics in real time, "is not to create energy, but to convince the universe to give you an advance on energy that already exists. It's like cosmic credit." She flipped a switch that probably didn't obey normal causality, and the machine hummed to life. Energy readings spiked across every sensor in the chamber. Not just normal energy, exotic energy, dark energy, energy that existed in theoretical frameworks that hadn't been developed yet. The machine was somehow extracting power directly from the quantum vacuum, creating a localized violation of thermodynamics that was technically impossible and undeniably functional. Energy output exceeding input by factors that should cause reality collapse, reported Aria 7, and the AI sounded almost giddy. Thermodynamic laws remain intact due to energy borrowing from 11 parallel dimensions. Solution classified as ingenious, terrifying, possibly universe-threatening if scaled up inappropriately. Challenge 2 completed. Time elapsed, 18 minutes, 12 seconds. In the observation deck, Dean Zareth was having what his species called an existential recalibration event. His energy form was flickering through colors that didn't have names, and several that actively hurt to perceive. "She's not just solving the problems," he said, his voice carrying harmonics of disbelief across multiple dimensions. "She's making the problems obsolete." "Sir," Professor Cathara said carefully, "should we be concerned that she's essentially created unlimited energy generation technology as a casual demonstration?" "Add it to the list," Dean Zareth replied wearily. "Right after revolutionized quantum mechanics and solved 4-century-old paradoxes by laughing at them." "Third and final challenge," Aria 7 announced. And for the first time since the evaluation began, the AI's voice carried something that might have been nervousness. The workshop vanished, replaced by something that wasn't quite a room and wasn't quite a concept. Maya found herself standing in a space that existed between thoughts, where ideas took physical form and reality was more of a suggestion than a rule. The ultimate challenge, the problem of problems. Before her appeared something that made the previous challenges look like children's puzzles. It was every unsolved question, every unanswered mystery, every problem that had ever stumped any intelligence in the history of the galaxy. They swirled around her in a maelstrom of pure intellectual challenge. The meaning of existence, the nature of time, the reason why socks disappear in laundry machines, the fundamental question of why anything exists at all. It was too much. The combined weight of every great mystery pressing down on a single mind should have been instantly overwhelming. Candidates who reached this point typically lasted 17 seconds before their consciousness simply gave up and retreated to a safe distance. Maya looked around at the swirling chaos of unsolved problems and did something unprecedented. She sat down, cross-legged, right there in the middle of infinity's greatest challenges, and closed her eyes. "What is she doing?" Vorthak whispered, his tentacles frozen in configurations of pure bewilderment. "I think," said Zelenth slowly, "she's meditating." The problems continued to swirl around her, vast questions that had consumed entire civilizations, but Maya just sat there, breathing calmly, apparently unbothered by the intellectual storm raging around her. Then she opened her eyes and smiled. "You know what?" she said, speaking to the universe itself. "These aren't really problems at all." The swirling slowed. "They're just questions we haven't figured out how to ask properly yet. The meaning of existence? Maybe existence doesn't need meaning. Maybe it just is, and that's enough. The nature of time? Time is what keeps everything from happening at once, and frankly, that's probably for the best." She stood up, dusting off her hands in that matter-of-fact way that had become disturbingly familiar to the observers. "And as for why anything exists at all," she grinned, "because nothing would be boring. The maelstrom of problems didn't disappear. They transformed. Each impossible question shifted from being an obstacle to being an opportunity. The great mysteries of existence rearranged themselves into something that looked almost like potential." Challenge 3 completed. Solution method. Recontextualization of fundamental assumptions. Result. Problems remain unsolved but are no longer problems. Time elapsed. 7 minutes, 24 seconds. Final evaluation protocol completed. Overall assessment. This candidate has demonstrated capabilities that exceed our measurement parameters. Recommend immediate admission to advanced research programs. The chamber returned to normal reality, though normal seemed like a relative term at this point. Maya stretched, yawned, and looked around with the satisfied expression of someone who just finished an enjoyable puzzle. "Well, that was fun. When do classes start?" In the observation deck, the assembled faculty of the most prestigious academy in the galaxy stood in stunned silence. They had just witnessed something that would be talked about for centuries, assuming their civilization survived long enough, which seemed more questionable now that humans were involved. "So," said Dean Zareth, his energy form now flickering in what might generously be called resigned acceptance, "I suppose we should discuss her course schedule." "Course schedule? Course schedule." Professor Kythara's voice cracked slightly. "Sir, she just solved problems that we use to challenge our doctoral candidates. I'm not sure we have anything left to teach her." "Oh, I wouldn't say that," Maya called up to them, apparently having heard every word despite the supposedly soundproof observation chamber. "There's always more to learn. Besides, I'm really curious about your advanced theoretical physics classes. I bet you've got some really interesting questions I haven't thought about yet." The professors looked at each other with the kind of expression typically reserved for beings who had just realized they were about to become students instead of teachers. "There is one more thing," Area 7 announced, breaking the shell-shocked silence. "According to Academy regulations, candidates who complete the final evaluation protocol with perfect scores are entitled to request modifications to the curriculum." Perfect scores? Of course she'd gotten perfect scores. "Oh, that's nice," Maya said cheerfully. "Could you maybe add some practical application classes? All this theoretical stuff is great, but I'd love to get my hands on some real engineering challenges. Maybe build some of those impossible machines, test out some of those paradox solutions in controlled environments." "Controlled environments," Dean Zareth repeated faintly. "Sure, safety first, right? Though I suppose safety is kind of relative when you're dealing with universe-bending technology." The phrase, universe-bending technology, hung in the air like a sword over everyone's head. We'll see what we can arrange," Dean Zareth said, making a mental note to contact the Galactic Insurance Consortium immediately. Maya beamed at them with the kind of innocent enthusiasm that had probably started several interstellar incidents throughout history. "This is going to be so much fun. I can't wait to see what other problems you've got that need solving. Oh, and Dean Zareth, that energy form you're using is really cool. The 17-dimensional matrix is elegant, but have you considered adding a temporal stabilization loop? It might help with the flickering." Dean Zareth looked down at his energy form, then at Maya, then at his energy form again. The flickering that had plagued him for centuries, that the finest scientists in the galaxy had declared unfixable, was indeed something that could be resolved with temporal stabilization. He'd just never thought to try it. "I'll look into that," he said weakly, as Maya was escorted to her new dormitory by a group of staff members who looked like they were leading someone to their execution rather than showing a new student to her room. Professor Kythara turned to her colleagues. "So," she said, her voice carefully neutral, "anyone else having second thoughts about the wisdom of teaching humans advanced physics?" "Third thoughts," muttered Vorthak. "Fourth thoughts," added Zelenth. "I'm up to somewhere around thoughts 12 through 15, Dean Zareth admitted, but it was too late now. Maya Sinclair was officially a student at the Galactic Academy, and somehow, the professors suspected that their quiet academic institution was about to become a very different place. The Academy had laughed at the idea that she'd fail the first test. Now they were wondering if the galaxy was ready for what she might accomplish with a proper education. The answer, as they would discover over the coming months, was a resounding no. But it was going to be absolutely fascinating to watch.